So there's this curious little verse towards the end of John's Gospel, just after the bit where Jesus talks about there being many rooms in his Father's house, and that he is the way, the truth, and the life, the perfect embodiment of his Father. Something we later see reflected in Colossians 1:15 and Hebrews 1:3. He then goes on to talk not about himself, but about all of those who believe in him. He says, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father." Even greater things than these. What do you think Jesus meant by that? Because Jesus did some pretty great things, right? Like turning water to wine, for example. That was pretty great. Like, I'd like to be able to do that, especially with the current cost of living crisis, just to be able to turn on the water tap and pour myself a nice glass of Merlot or a Pinot. That'd be awesome. Or about the time he walked on water, that was pretty great too, just skating over the lake to meet up with the lads. Or what about the time that he fed 5,000 people? That was really cool. Like, imagine popping to Aldi and grabbing a loaf of bread and a packet of salmon and then having that last for the entire month. I guess you'd be kind of fed up with salmon sandwiches, but the savings you would make would be worth it. What about Jesus raising people from the dead? That'd be a really good superpower to have, wouldn't it? And yet, we don't see Jesus' followers performing these kinds of miracles very often, do we? I'm not even sure what greater versions of these miracles would be. Turning water into single malt whiskey, perhaps, or maybe walking on lava, or adding a dessert course to the feeding of the 5,000. I don't know. So I don't think these are the works that Jesus is talking about when he said, "You will do even greater things than these." I think those miracles were simply, as John suggests, signs. Not the thing itself, just something that points towards the thing. They help people recognize that Jesus was who he said he was. And even then, people had their doubts. In fact, I think if Jesus performed these miracles today, no one would believe him. We'd put it down to sleight of hand or camera trickery, such as the age of skepticism that we live in. So if Jesus isn't talking about miracles when he says, "Whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing," what is he talking about? It must be some other aspect of his life and ministry. Didn't Jesus say, "The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and to love your neighbour as yourself"? And didn't Jesus call his followers to be a light to the world and commission them to take the gospel to all nations? Perhaps these are the kinds of works that he's talking about then. Maybe that feels a little bit overwhelming, like a huge responsibility, right? Far beyond the average person. But what I want you to know today is that it really isn't. You don't need to be some great preacher or teacher or evangelist to do the work that Jesus has called you to do. In fact, if recent revelations have taught us anything, it's that being put on that particular pedestal rarely leads to anything good. No, you just need to be you and use the superpowers that God has already given to you. That's right, I said superpowers. You have superpowers, and I want you to know today what they are. Beginning with this, you, yes you, have the power of invitation. Sorry if you were hoping for invisibility or bulletproof skin, but trust me, this is better, because your power of invitation can actually save someone's life. You can move someone from the outside to the inside. You could help someone who feels unseen and alone know that they are seen and loved. You have the power to let people know that they are wanted. And that's awesome. You know, as a society, we are more connected than ever before, and yet people often feel profoundly lonely. I think it's because digital connection hasn't yet been able to replace human connection. It's a useful tool in our hands, but what we really need at the end of the day is each other. Sometimes I think we underestimate this power of invitation because we have these false expectations of the outcome. For example, if we invite someone to church, we maybe expect them to make some sort of a decision or a confession of faith, and when they don't, we can end up feeling like we've failed somehow. And that fear of failure prevents us from asking others. We sort of think maybe it's best to stick to the people we already know. Actually, I think we may have overcomplicated this whole process. We even have this special prayer that we expect people to pray, don't we? You know, the whole like ABC prayer. First you have to accept Jesus in your heart, and then believe he died for your sins, and then finally confess your deepest, darkest secrets, and then go on to lead a perfect life or something. But you know, the problem I have with that prayer is that I can't find Jesus asking anyone to pray it. I actually can't find it anywhere in the Bible. But what Jesus did do, however, was use the power of invitation. Follow me. They were the first and last words he spoke to his apostle Peter. Such a simple invitation. Come on, let's do this. Let's do life together. Come with me. I'll show you the way to go. He said, come and you will see, in John 1:39. Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest, Mark 6:31. Come to me all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest, Matthew 11:28. Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink, in John 7:37. And my absolute favourite invitation of Jesus's, come and have breakfast, John 21:12. Yes, please, Jesus, I'll bring the hash browns. Jesus, he made these simple invitations that had a profound effect on those who responded, because they weren't signing up for a meeting or a program, but being invited into a relationship. You know, Jesus' disciples, they were never perfect. They were messy and complicated. People who said stupid things like, let's call down fire from heaven and destroy this place, and did even stupider things like chopping off people's ears and arguing about who was the most important. But Jesus never rescinded his invitation. He just continued to love them, to journey with them, and to give them another opportunity to get it right. As I think back to the most significant moments in my journey of faith, they nearly all begin with an invitation. It was an invitation to go on a youth weekend away when I was a teenager, to be a part of something, an invitation to sit around a table and share a meal that led to friendships that have lasted for 30 years now. Even my time in this church began with an invitation to come and help lead a children's weekend away back in 2003. I was unknown to this church then, just some guy who was dating the pastor's daughter, but I was invited to take part, not just to sit on the sidelines and watch, but to actually join in. And that invitation meant the world to me. I'd been running kids and youth clubs for years at that point, but never felt like my passion had found its home. And I met people that weekend that have had a profound impact on my life. Young people who eventually became members of the youth club I would lead and have since become friends and family. People that I've shared some of the most significant moments of my life with. People that I've laughed with and cried with. But it all began with an invitation. Come along. Lend a hand. Get involved. That's all. That's the amazing thing about this idea of belonging before believing, right? It says to someone, we want you to be a part of the journey wherever you end up. And so use your power of invitation. Don't have expectations. Just invite people to share in the journey of life. Go for a walk, eat a meal, welcome them into your home if you're fortunate enough to have one. Be open to the journey because, it might just save someone's life. Okay, next superpower, because you haven't just got one, you've got multiple superpowers. You're like Superman or Wonder Woman, but with less revealing clothes. You have the power to blow up people's expectations of God. Now, this is a cool one, because most people have certain expectations of God and will indeed have expectations of you if you tell them you're a Christian. And some of those expectations will be wrong. It's your job to blow them up. And this is actually one of my favorite things that Jesus did. He took people's preconceived ideas of who God is and what God does, and crucially, who God wants to be with, and he just smashed them to smithereens. Think about it. Essentially, his whole ministry was him subverting people's expectations of God. That's why so many people had trouble believing he was who he said he was. Right from the start, he chose not to be born in a palace as a king, but as a refugee who spent his childhood fleeing from the authorities. He chose nobodies and the despised to be his closest followers, teenagers who were brash, rash, and nowhere near as flash as they thought they were. He chose to spend time with those others considered unclean, unwelcome, and unworthy of any attention. He chose to associate with thieves and sex workers and misfits and malcontents. People were always saying, what's he doing over there? Like, why is he with them? Doesn't he know what they've done, what they've been up to? He knew. He just loved them anyway. He chose to heal those people who sought his help without prejudice or preferential treatment. Soldiers and lepers and children and people who hung out in graveyards, even mother-in-laws received healing. He chose to elevate those that others looked down upon, especially those who needed help, especially those who had come to the end of themselves. He chose to challenge the authorities and the religiously pious and point out their hidden hypocrisy. He called people instead to honesty, to openness before a God of compassion. He chose to frame God not as this tyrant waiting to destroy the sinful, but as a woman in search of a missing coin, a shepherd in search of a wayward sheep, a father in search of a lost son. And he chose to confront the demons that tormented the weak and the broken, not to separate himself from the darkness, but to be a light in its midst. He chose to interact with foreigners and those whose faith was not like his own. He tore down barriers and the walls that people had put up through hatred and fear, and he chose to point out the goodness and the faithfulness in people that others couldn't see. And instead of vengeance and violence, he chose mercy and forgiveness. And instead of the sword, he chose the cross. And instead of death, he chose resurrection. Jesus was the ultimate expectation smasher. And I don't think he's changed all that much. But I do think that sometimes we don't recognize him because he isn't matching our expectations. Sometimes we make these little boxes for God. And we say to people, hey, you want to meet God? You need to get it here in this little box. And then when they look and say, I don't think I'm going to fit in that particular box, we say, well, in that case, I guess God's not for you. Maybe come back when you've lost some limbs. The church I grew up in, it was a little bit like one of those boxes. It taught me that if I wanted to experience God's presence, then I needed to look and act and think in a certain way. I needed to learn certain songs that for some reason only use the chords G, C, E minor and D. I needed to attend a certain type of service with a really long time of singing and an even longer sermon. I needed to dress in a particular way. I wasn't permitted to wear a hat. I don't know why God hated baseball caps back then, but I didn't question it. Women could wear hats, but then they also had to wear long skirts as well. And there were these other divides between men and women too. For example, men could teach, but women couldn't, unless they were teaching like the Sunday school, because I guess kids are less important than adults. There was a particular way of worshipping as well. You couldn't just sing the songs. If you really wanted to experience God, you had to pray in tongues and prophesy, which seemed to be mostly about making these vague predictions about what God was doing at that particular moment. Usually something about new wineskins or putting flesh on dry bones. And I'm not saying that God wasn't in those meetings. I'm sure he showed up from time to time. I mean, God does like to be where people are, after all. But just that was the God-shaped box that I inherited. It was the only way I knew of experiencing God, which as an introvert who wasn't entirely comfortable with speaking in tongues or prophesying in front of 200 people was a bit tricky. I much preferred Jesus' suggestion of going into my own room and shutting the door. I often felt like an imposter in those meetings, like everybody else had more of God than me because I didn't quite fit that mold. But then certain people used their superpower on me. They helped me see that God is bigger than the box the church wanted to put him into. They showed me other ways to experience him. They helped me see that it was okay to be me. Back then I was a very shy and reserved teenager. I started to listen to some of the female voices in my life, and I learnt that God and masculinity are not the same thing. And throughout my life and ministry, I've had the privilege of meeting many people who have blown up my expectations of God in this way. I've heard and I've read some amazing stories from people who have shifted my perspective to help me realize how big God really is, that he is alive and at work through people from every gender and sexuality and race and culture across this entire planet. If I can give you some advice, have a look at your Christian books and make sure they're not all written by white men, because if they are, there might be a whole lot of God that you're missing out on. But here's the thing with this superpower. There are people in your life that will believe that God is not for them because of what they've been told or shown through the churches and communities they belong to in the past, or even maybe the stories that they've inherited from others. You have the power to blow up those expectations. There's a story in Acts 8 where Philip, a believer in Jesus, meets this Ethiopian eunuch on his way to Jerusalem. In the first century, the eunuchs were kind of a sexual minority. According to Deuteronomy 23:1, were not permitted to access the temple. They were seen as people to be avoided, kept out, no place in the kingdom of God. But Philip, at the prompting of God, goes up to him and begins to tell him about Jesus, who made a way for everyone to come in. It says in verse 36, as they travelled along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What can stand in the way of my being baptized?" And Philip doesn't hesitate. He gets straight in the water with him, and he makes him a part of the family of God. And the whole of Acts is like this. The church of Christ becoming increasingly diverse as people's expectations of who God is are just shattered all over the place. I already think one of the worst things that can happen to a church is that everyone starts to look and think exactly alike. Because the kingdom of Jesus, it's supposed to be diverse. It's supposed to be wide and beautiful. And the more it grows, the more of God we can see reflected in his creation. We need to make sure God doesn't look just like us, because we're slipping into idolatry. God is way, way bigger. So blow up people's expectations of God. Okay, another power. How about the power of kindness? Now again, I know that doesn't sound particularly cool. It's not flight or super speed or anything like that. But just like the power of invitation, kindness can also save lives. And it's a power that we all have. I think kindness is maybe one of the greatest spiritual gifts that's been given to us. Never mind tongues and prophecy and all that. Kindness has the power to alter the course of someone's life, to break down walls, to soften hearts. It allows us to demonstrate the love of Christ to both friends and strangers alike. And Jesus was all about kindness. Sometimes that aspect of his life and ministry gets overlooked because, as I pointed out earlier, we're often more drawn to the miraculous. But even his miracles were kind. Think about the way that he healed the man with leprosy in Matthew 8. Jesus could have said, "Leprosy be gone," and the dude would have been healed. Or he could have said, "Go and wash in the lake." But instead, it says that he reached out and touched the man. I wonder how long it had been since he had felt the touch of another, living in a leper colony away from people. Back then, people were discouraged from even standing downwind from someone who had leprosy. But Jesus was kind. Kind of reminds me of the video of Princess Diana shaking hands with the lepers in 1989. There was something of the spirit of Jesus in that moment, I think. When the children wanted to come near to Jesus, but the disciples shooed them away, he said, No. Let them come to me. And he prayed for them and he blessed them. Back then, children were ideally neither seen nor heard, but Jesus was kind. When the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years tried to sneak healing from inside the crowd, he made sure that she knew she'd been seen, that people heard him calling her daughter. When Peter messed up time and time again, Jesus forgave him. He found ways to gently restore his faith. He was kind. When Simon was quick to criticize and tear down the sinful woman in Luke 7, Jesus used his words to build her up, to let her know that she was loved and appreciated and seen. When the crowd wanted to throw stones at the woman caught in adultery, Jesus made sure that she would receive no condemnation from him. And maybe the most transformative act of kindness is that of Zacchaeus. Luke 19. He was this guy that was so despised by the crowds that he was forced to climb a tree to get a glimpse of Jesus passing by. But Jesus saw him in the tree and said, "Come down. I want to stay with you today." The crowds hated it. They were like, "He's gone to the home of a sinner. He's being the guest of a sinner." But through that one tiny act of kindness, Zacchaeus ended up changing his entire outlook on life. He gave half his possessions to the poor. He paid back those he'd cheated 4 times the amount that he'd taken. And what did Jesus do? Did he preach a sermon that made him feel super guilty? Did he tell him unless he immediately changed his ways, he would be burning in hell forever? Did he use some kind of Jedi mind trick? "You will be a better tax collector"? No, none of that. He was just willing to hang out. American politician Bob Kerrey once said, "Unexpected kindness is the most powerful, least costly, and most underrated agent of human change." I think he was right. It requires so little from us and yet is capable of producing so much good in the world. Whether it's a simple touch on the shoulder, a hug given with permission, a kind word or an encouraging message, or maybe even just a random act of compassion like Jesus spoke of in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Kindness has the ability to transform lives. One of my favourite quotes of all time comes from theologian Frederick Buechner. And he said, "If you want to be holy, be kind. Not self-righteous, not pious or preachy or theologically sound. Be kind." It's a superpower, Okay. Well, I'm already well over my word limit for an average sermon, so I'm not going to talk too much more. But there are other powers that you have. You have your words. Words are so powerful. Words can be used to tear people down or build people up. They can be used to destroy or to help people grow. I've been the recipient of so many kind words over the years that have given me the ability to believe in myself. And what does it really cost you to say to someone, I really appreciate you. Thank you for being in my life. I think you're great. I think you shine. One word can change the course of someone's entire day. What about presence? That's a good superpower. I think it's one that's becoming rarer these days because we're so distracted all the time, aren't we? Many of us can't even go to the toilet without taking our phone with us, catching up on a bit of YouTube or whatever. But to give someone your full attention, to help them feel seen, to help them feel heard, it's such a gift. Civil rights activist Maya Angelou said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. That's true. So when Jesus said, whoever believes in me will do the works I've been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, this is what I think he was talking about. Those little acts of love and compassion and kindness and grace that make all the difference. That decision that we make to love our neighbour as ourselves, to be that light in the darkness, to be those carriers of something different, some good news for a change. I think he was talking about the way that we show love to each other. A love that is patient and kind. A love that does not envy or boast or act pridefully. A love that doesn't dishonour others or act out of self-interest. A love that's not easily angered and keeps no record of wrongs. A love that doesn't delight in evil but rejoices in truth. A love that always protects, always trusts, always hopes and always perseveres. Where there are prophecies, they'll cease. Where there are tongues, they'll be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it'll pass away. But these three remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these, the greatest, is love. I think that's somewhere in the Bible. Many of you are already doing that greater work that Jesus has called you to. Perhaps without even realizing, through your invitation, through your blowing up of people's expectations, through your random acts of kindness and love, through your words, and even your very presence. I would just encourage you, keep it up. Use your powers. Be that light in the darkness. Jesus sees you. He said, truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me. So keep shining for Jesus.